The China in Africa podcast is brought to you in partnership with the Africa-China Reporting Project at Wits University in Johannesburg. The ACRP promotes balanced, considered reporting on Africa-China relations through innovative training programs held throughout the year. More information at africachinareporting.co.za.
Hello and welcome to another edition of the China in Africa podcast, a proud member of the Sinica Network from SupChina. I'm Eric Olander, and as always, I'm joined by Cobus van Staden, the senior China-Africa researcher at the South African Institute of International Affairs in Johannesburg, South Africa. A very good morning to you, Cobus.
Good morning.
Cobus, there's been a lot of movement in the past, say, 4 to 5 weeks in the agricultural space, particularly in agricultural trade. And this is an especially important topic right now, given that we're trying to see what the post-COVID-19 era is going to look like and how so many of Africa's economies that are struggling today are going to get back on their feet again. Agriculture might be one of the areas. And it's interesting because there's been about 4 or 5 different trade announcements that I want to kind of bring your attention to. And Cobus, I'd like to get your take on what all this means. Last month, back in August, an Africa cocoa trading center opened in Hunan province in China, in the city of Changsha. Now, right now, it's only handling imported cocoa from Ghana, but eventually officials say it'll be open to other countries as well. There was a lot of excitement about that. And then finally this week, after a year and a half, and we talked about this, Cobus, back in early 2019, about Kenyan avocados are now finally making their way to China. Now, the holdup had been for a year and a half was the fact that the avocados had to be flash frozen before they're sent to China, in part because they want to prevent any pests from making their way over. This is a different restriction than when Kenya exports avocados to Europe. And because Kenyan farmers needed to buy those flash freezers, it really delayed the whole process. But the first consignment of Kenyan avocados has finally made it into China, and that opens up the possibility that that might expand a lot. And the reason why this is so important is because a lot of Kenyan farmers who are growing coffee today are eager to switch over to avocados because the profit margin and the labor required for avocados is much less than for coffee. Also, the Kenyan Export Promotion and Branding Agency, this is a new agency that's come up in the past few weeks, plans to open up a new tea distribution center in the eastern Chinese province of Fujian. Now, although China is currently not a top destination for Kenyan black tea, trade authorities seem to be very excited about this opportunity, in part because Chinese consumers are drinking a lot more milk tea, the boba teas, and those use black teas in particular. And there's a real growth in the demand for black tea. China's a major green tea producer, but Kenyan exporters seem to think that there's an opportunity there to grow the China market ahead. And then, of course, this is just great. I love this story. There was an amazing Rwandan coffee sale that took place back in May on the Chinese shopping site Taobao. And 3,000 bags, which is about 1.5 tons of coffee, sold out in less than 60 seconds. And that was all done. I mean, that's just one of those only in China stories. So naturally, that's gotten coffee producers and coffee exporters very excited about the huge potential to expand the China market for African blends from not only from Rwanda, but also Kenya, Ethiopia, and elsewhere. So, Cobus, it is really exciting to see all of this activity in the agricultural space. And it's interesting that we're moving beyond just the oil, mineral, and timber trade that has dominated so much of China-Africa commerce over the past, say, 15, 20 years. But I guess the question for me is it really enough to make a difference? What do you think?
I think it could be potentially in the future. It's obviously starting quite small at the moment, but it points towards a future where African economies could be making significant foreign currency from selling agricultural products internationally. Keep in mind that many African countries are already selling agricultural products to Europe, and the size of the Chinese market is very encouraging. There are a few caveats though. One being, like, as you said, these products have to be approved product by product. So it's a very kind of lengthy and slow process. And there's lots of ways, and we see this particularly in Europe, there's lots of ways for local kind of bodies to try and keep competition out. So it's not an easy process to get your products in. I think the bigger issue is what's happening with intra-African trade, and because there I think there is real potential for to lift, kind of hundreds of millions of people out of poverty. South Africa, for example, is already importing lots of agricultural products from all over the continent. I was just looking through my own kitchen, and I saw cashews from Tanzania and Mozambique, broccoli from Kenya, flowers, of course, very large in Kenya that come to South Africa, and so there is the potential for kind of intra-African trade to be boosted, particularly on the back of the Continental Free Trade Agreement. But there's many hurdles in that path as well.
So let's think about where we are in terms of agricultural trade with China. And this great article came onto our site, and we published it last week, Rethinking China's Participation in African Agricultural Development in the Post-COVID-19 Era. And I love the fact that we're starting to think beyond the current crisis. And it was written by Duncan Chando, who's a Nairobi-based international development consultant, and also Cathy Cao, who we've had on the show before. She's a policy and partnerships analyst at the International Fund for Agricultural Development in Beijing. Duncan and Cathy, thank you so much for joining us.
Thank you.
Thank you.
So you guys wrote this article. It's excellent. It's I really love the idea that we're starting to think beyond the crisis, even though we're still very much in the midst of this crisis. But long-term planning is critical. You talked about 5 ways China can enhance its agricultural engagement in Africa. Before we get to those 5 ways, Duncan, I'd like for you to kind of lay the groundwork for where we are today in terms of the issues that you highlighted in your piece about food security, trade, unemployment, and then, of course, talking about this all in the context of COVID-19.
We realize that we are in a situation whereby, at this moment, Africa, even before COVID, automatically, Africa was already facing a lot of challenges in terms of food security. And there's a research even in 2018 that showed that a number of millions of people already facing hunger. So even as we look at COVID generally is escalating this situation, because right now there are a lot of measures in different countries that have taken place, and this has really impacted the way agriculture is being done. So just to look at some of these issues, we find that for example, in many countries, some of them there were a lot of lockdowns, and this lockdown actually affected the way agricultural produce will move from point A to point B. Giving example, for example, in Kenya, whereby I think a number of areas were locked. And most farmers also depend in taking their produce to the bigger cities, Mombasa, Kisumu, Nairobi. And for a very long time, during COVID, some of these counties were locked out, so you could not move in and out of Nairobi. And even though it was possible for cargo to move, but for farmers it was a bit expensive, because most of them also relied on normal day-to-day transport. So doing the cargo was a bit, again, becoming more and more expensive for some of these farmers.
Cathy, Eric mentioned the possibilities of trade and exports, and then we also mentioned the issue of food security. How do those two come together? Is it possible for both of those problems to be solved at once by the same set of farmers, or are we looking at completely two different issues that need to be tackled in different ways?
So thank you, Cobus. Firstly, I think in terms of food security and food trade, all this happen within the food system. So these issues are certainly interlinked. It's a matter of how does it linked with different people. So in terms of food security, as Duncan mentioned earlier on, in the COVID-19 situation, that you look at in Africa, Sub-Sahara, the vulnerable countries, they're getting even more vulnerable. We are using more new project poor people. And because of the food disruptions, then there are even more people under food insecurity. Then this also happens even before COVID-19. Those countries has been affected also because of climate change or fragile states or whatever. So what I wanted to see here is then the food insecurity, it matters more for the vulnerable, that group of people. They are already rural poor. Where when you talk about food trade, it also linked to the rural poor. For instance, because of the food disruptions, the supply chain has or the lack of finance, or the supply chain has interrupted, and then the farmers, they cannot no longer sell the food because of COVID-19, then obviously they get affected. Then so in terms of how to link these two together, I think we should sort of have a long-term plan, resilience for the people, no matter they are rural poor or they are people even in the urban area, because in the end, everyone has to eat.
And eating is obviously, critical. I mean, it's one of the foundations of life. And one of the challenges in Africa, of course, is the fact that it's a net importer of food. And so it's using also hard currency to purchase food. I was just reading the other day that Vietnam is going to be selling more rice to Africa. And that is something that is difficult for a lot of people to understand, given the fact that there's so much agricultural potential in Africa, but yet it is still a net importer of food. Duncan, let's now start through the list. You guys listed 5 different ways that China can enhance its agricultural engagement. I'd like you to be as specific as possible about the Chinese side of this, both the pros and the cons. Your point number 1 in your piece was early warning system support. What do you mean by that?
What we mean by early warning system support is you find that in many countries, there's a lot of lack of qualified professionals, such as meteorologists, agrometeorologists, and then we also have like weak capacity in terms of the investment, and at the same time, both at the national and the regional level in most African countries. So when you talk about early warning system, we find even if you look at the Sendai document that really attribute that there's a need for us to achieve SDGs. There's a need to invest in trying to look at some of these situations that arise before any pandemic, or especially in agricultural aspect. So when you look at this with China, how China can come in and support most of these African countries, is obvious that a lot of Chinese private companies are already working in African countries. And I think it can be a very interesting point of view whereby a number of Chinese companies can initiate, like we can have a public-private partnership in the area of early warning system. Because currently, as we see that most countries are not having a strong point in this particular area. So these can again reduce if most of these Chinese companies, which are already working in African countries, if they partner with either the government, both at the national level, or in most countries also we now have the devolved system, for example in Kenya, whereby this will reduce the reliance on donors, because many a times we find that most Western donors sometimes in terms of giving support, the view is a bit different. So through this collaboration, I know that mostly I think we're also focusing on the South-South triangular cooperation, whereby I know with China there's some similarities that even the way they do the agriculture, maybe there's some little similarity of agricultural system within Africa. So through South-South triangular cooperation, either it can be through knowledge, sharing of knowledge, or it can be through maybe in this context of COVID, a lot of webinars can be used to address this, to support most African countries in the area of early warning system. And again, a good food security information system can be put in place, because this is something that, again, which is lacking, and data is a very key specific thing that is needed if we are to address food security. So we need to ensure that some of this data is accessible not only at the national level, but also at the continental level, so that it can help within countries with regional to plan together in addressing some of these issues. Because truth be told, there are a lot of challenges that are facing most African countries, which are similar. I think we've had the recent issues of for example, the locust that has affected most countries. So if you have some of this research put together and data put together, I think it can be a very good way in which China can support most African countries.
So let me understand that you're saying, when you say China, you're not referring to the government, you're talking about Chinese companies, right?
Yeah, we're talking...
I guess the reason why I'm skeptical of that is that Chinese companies, for the most part, especially in Africa, are not really that well known for their corporate social responsibility and for being engaged in these types of activities. What gives you the idea or the optimism that this is something appealing to Chinese companies?
Because I think when we look at some of these, weather patterns, they can also, when they come, they also affect some of the companies that are working. For example, the mining company, when there's a lot of flooding and it was not well predicted, sometimes it impedes their work. So if they can invest in supporting most of these African countries, then in the end, in the long run, they might also be benefiting, because given that most African countries are not well endowed in terms of infrastructure. So if they do this, then I think is a win-win situation, in my opinion.
I just want to jump in. I think I pretty much agree with what my colleague mentioned earlier on. Just back to your question about private sector CSRs in Africa. I think it's not that there are not. But if you look, take just one example. If you look at Alibaba during the COVID-19, they are the ones that are sending PPEs around to many African countries, and as well in recent years they actually initiate a social and entrepreneurial type of training for the young Africans. So I think a lot of times it's not that the China companies they doesn't want to do such type of work. I think it applies to to many companies. It's a matter of how you matchmake the national needs or the what the ground people lead or the vulnerable groups needs to the companies, either products or their social responsibilities that they agree with or that are also priorities to them.
Cathy, in the same vein, your second recommendation is Chinese support for social grants to help vulnerable groups within African societies to get over the COVID-19 crisis without falling into complete poverty. A similar question: do you foresee the Chinese government being involved in that, or other Chinese actors like Chinese companies?
Well, I think this is a very interesting question. Firstly, when we talk about China's aid or grants to Africa, it's a lot of times a bit complicated. We don't know whether it's free or it's loan or it's investment. But when we were actually this recommendation came from my discussion with my colleague. When we're discussing about this, we thought for grants, a lot of times you can expect the China government, to provide through their development cooperation framework. And if you look at the data or look back what China's strategy to Africa, indeed, China does provide, or at least in their agenda, they provide grants. But what we found is when China provides grants to Africa, a lot of times these grant criteria for the topics are a bit too general, that you don't know what are the clear objectives. At least for me, from a development professional perspective, if I have an international development project to work for instance, rural poor, I have an objective either to enhance the productivity of the specific rural poor or empower the rural woman. So that's why we come up with this recommendation. We think in a COVID-19 situation, as well as the post-COVID-19 situation, the youth unemployment is one of the critical social issues, as well as the women that are left behind, the rural women. They need some assets or some capacity building trainings to give them sort of opportunities to enhance their income. That's why in the end we conclude that we are expecting, or if we may allow, or if we suggest when China to provide grants or aids to African countries, they could be more specific, especially on the youth, the rural women, and the elderly.
You've also talked about those communities are also tied in with this productivity question. And Duncan, let's go to this question, point number 3 in your essay, really addressing that food security is tied to the output from African farms. So if you can increase the productivity, more food can be generated, and obviously that can help address some of the food security challenges. Talk to us about the enhanced production capacities that you suggest.
Yeah, actually, truth be told, in most African setup, sometimes most people they do agriculture as a way of life, and sometimes there's the aspect of economic that is lacking in most of them. And at the same time, you find that most of them also do agricultural from a small scale point of view. So with land available in most African countries, I think when productivity is enhanced, and this one can be through mechanization, because technology is a key thing in ensuring that there's mass production. And given that most people will only rely on manual labor, which right now is not sufficient, given that also a lot of young people who used to participate in agriculture in the rural area have also migrated to the cities. So you find that there's a lack of labor that can support this productivity. So in saying this, I think China can really help in building technology, because China is already doing this in terms of the demonstration centers that in some countries. I know in most, even in East Africa, there are some countries where there are demonstration centers, and we have people coming from China, experts coming from China, and helping farmers to learn new technology and how they can increase their production. But at the same time also, we live in a situation whereby learning is very key. So through this collaboration, again, through Chinese government or Chinese development partners can try and support the issue of agricultural modernization and supporting technology. At the same time, this can also help in focusing also mostly in among the youth and women, like my colleague said, because there's the entrepreneurship point of view of agriculture, which now is gaining shape, but still there's a long way to go, because a lot of people have lost their jobs, even post-COVID. I know most people will not have jobs, but agriculture can play a very, very important role in ensuring that this group of people that have lost their jobs can be tapped, because there's with good technology, at the same time with good training, this one can be a blessing in disguise in a way post-COVID.
And can you be more specific again, as when you say Chinese partners, who are you referring to?
We are referring to Chinese government through the ODA's support and through grant to most African countries.
The China partners, the actors, I think private sectors, they are also included, because if you ever read our article, we had stated clearly the China private sector, especially those e-commerce companies, they could provide support to promote small, medium entrepreneurial and enterprises in rural areas in Africa, especially the youth-oriented and women-inclusive e-commerce and value chain development. I think those points are sort of like comparative advantages which China, many Chinese companies has. And if there are some proper platforms, or if there are some in-depth dialogues, we could really think about those comparative advantages that to bring to African to sort of localized, and then in the end to benefit to the rural youth or rural women in African countries.
But other than Alibaba, who else is active in the Chinese e-commerce space in Africa that would be capable of doing something like this?
I think initially, I heard some, like there is a foreign company which is Transin. Yes, they have been working on like using mobiles such as to sort of promote e-payment or system in Africa, but I don't know details.
Duncan, in your fourth point is one that we raise a lot on this podcast, is that there needs to be more investment in rural infrastructure in order to facilitate the kind of supply lines from the areas where agriculture is practiced to the ports and so on to get it out. And that includes not only roads, but also warehouses, irrigation systems, and so on. Is there a way in which African countries can grow that infrastructure without putting themselves further into debt? Because, up to now, what we've seen, like China has built a lot of infrastructure in Africa, but it's almost always on the back of loans. So how do you balance those two?
Yeah, what you're saying is true, because I know the aspect of infrastructure is a big challenge especially for the rural poor, and given that agriculture is also practiced mostly in rural parts of most African countries, and truth be told, that a lot of produce is being lost between the farm and when they reach maybe the capital city because of poor storage, like you've mentioned, or because also of poor roads, so the transportation is hindered. But again, I know most African countries, the infrastructure is based on loans, yes, but I think it's also a way of through which it can be done in a way that there's a benefit for both Chinese private partners who are working in African countries, but at the same time also benefiting the community where they work with. Because, like for example, if you'll find that some Chinese companies, they do win big tenders to do roads in African countries, and when they do this, I think it can also be a good point of them, like trying to support most of these feeder roads, either through I can say through CSR, because when they get this contract to construct major highways, I think they can also chip in through supporting some of these feeder roads that goes into the highway, and this can also help rural farmers, in my opinion. But again, the issue of food security also post-COVID is still a big challenge, because infrastructure is still a big problem. And also, this also goes back in looking at even issues of electricity, which also support, for example, in warehousing and for these perishable goods, it can be still a big challenge. So there's still a long way to go, but I think it's just a stepping stone. I mean, we can start one step at a time.
Eric, I would like to come back to this very interesting question again, because this is obviously a hot topic when we're talking about China-African relations, or especially China's investment in Africa. But I would just want to give you a quick data. The recent research estimates that 73 million people will be acutely food insecure in Africa, and the UN report says the continent needs to raise more than 100 billion USD to address the economic and health impact of COVID-19. So what I am emphasize here is indeed the continent, African continent, it needs some money. It needs money fund to tackle its challenges. So it's a matter of how this money comes from, either investment or loan or whatever. I recall one time I had a conversation with African delegations in Beijing. So when we come back to this topic about first the issue, Africa needs money. Second, then which type of fund you want. Then the delegation were actually telling me from their perspective one solution is that a few African countries join together to speak to the countries that are the big investors to Africa. It can be they jointly work together to speak to China, or they jointly work together to speak to OECD countries. I think this is in this type of way, then you have more bargaining power to decide which type of finance you want. This is one point. My second point come back to this question, this long investment issue is, I think now we are still living in a global world that multinationalism is still pretty much appreciated by most countries. So UN is still here, international organizations are there. So I'm thinking when China partner with Africa in terms of infrastructure projects, whether the UN organizations come in, then it sort of help to balance the power between the two individual countries, or or somebody as a middleman that to sort of to adjust the different power relations between each other.
Well, to be fair, to your point on African countries coming together to actually ask for debt relief and debt sustainability, they have done that. They have done that in so many different ways, whether it's through the African Union, through the United Nations Economic Commission for Africa, so many different ways. China, in particular, has been absolutely clear. It is not going to wipe away the debt. It's been very, very clear. And so China is very much part of the problem here. The fact that those debt payments are still being made today. And so when we talk about where does the money come from, also the private creditors have not budged at all. There's not been any relief from private creditors. Only the multilaterals, IMF, World Bank, have given the flexibility. But interestingly enough, the G20's DSSI is only through this year. It's not even that significant. So there's been no meaningful debt relief. And so when we talk about, and this is something that Cobus and I have talked about on many previous shows, the international community is pretty clear that they're not that concerned about Africa's well-being. And I guess my key question for both of you before we get to point number 5, Cathy, you really made an interesting point here. We're talking about 73 million people who are facing food insecurity on the continent. That's a huge number of people. And my suspicion is that's probably a low number given the economic crisis that the continent is facing today. Are public-private partnerships really the best way? This really seems like it calls for government action on the scale that governments can bring. Alibaba can't help. China Road and Bridge Corporation can't do anything because it's voluntary on their part. Corporate social responsibility, by definition, is a voluntary act on behalf of a company. And they're not going to bring that many resources to it, right? They're going to put a little bit, but at the end of the day, companies are in Africa to do one thing, to generate profit. That's what a company's there to do. They're not there to help people on food security. They're not there to build roads for, off of the main road into a farm. It's the right thing to do. It's a moral thing to do, but that's not what they're there for. They have their stakeholders who they're accountable for to bring results back. This is really the job of governments to do. And so I guess I'm a little bit surprised, and Duncan, maybe you can address this, that your article didn't really call on governments who have the resources to do this, to do more. And the Chinese government in particular to do more. What's your thought, Duncan?
Because generally, government is already doing their part, but again, when you look at the whole aspect, because also our focus, we're also looking at the promotion of South Triangular cooperation, and these also there are different ways through these. Through which this can be done, because one of them, again, when you look at technology transfer, for example, is a key area. So sometimes if we have even some of these companies training some of African people to take up some of these roles. So government is already doing their role, because a lot of African countries have been given loans from China. But again, we're also emphasizing on a lot of companies which in our opinion, they're not doing that much. It's high time that they take up this and try to support most of these African countries where they already making a lot of profit, either through mining or through road construction. They're already making profit. And it is high time that some of this profit they're making should go back in empowering some of this community, because we even see this in most African countries whereby, for example, in Kenya, a lot of companies are also trying to support the communities where they work with. Yes, Cathy, you have something maybe?
Yes, thank you. Actually, I just want to quickly go back to the debt relief, just a very quick reflection on that. My point was that during when the different parties are actually talking about the deals, the facilities, when you are designing this fund facility, that was the time to bargain, to really speak out your interest. But it's a bit hard. Once everything has been settled, the plan has been there, you sort of already doing this project halfway, then you're taken back to ask them to sort of change the initial agreement. I think that's always not a very easy way to work on. Then come back to the food security thing. I very much agree with you, Eric. I think in this, especially you look at the COVID-19 time, how the government reacts, it really has dramatic impact on the community. And I do think the government should really equip their capacities or have enough their resources to react a shock like this. But then if you look back our recommendations, no matter about rural infrastructure or enhanced production or social protections, these recommendations also applies to the national government, like on how they reacted. I think to tackle a food security issue, the critical issue is to address the root causes of why they are rural, why they are rural poor, and why youth doesn't have jobs. It is really to build their, the vulnerable groups' resilience, so that today there's a COVID-19 and tomorrow climate change, whatever shocks come, then they can tackle. And then in this process, government, of course, play a critical role. And when we put this in a China-African cooperation, I think a lot of times this type of cooperation has been implemented by the national governments in Africa, or at least coordinated by national government. So I think in this type of dynamics or negotiations or project formulations, it is a way. There are sort of capacity building for the national governments as well.
Duncan, you in your fifth point, you bring up an area that I think is a relatively kind of easy area for cooperation between big companies and governments, which is the need to digitize all the way through the supply chain. Can you talk a little bit about that and like which roles you see different actors fulfilling?
I mean, in terms of digitalization, one is, truth be told, that most African countries right now, there's a big wave toward digitalization, especially even in Africa, either through e-commerce platform, whereby most farmers are also using digital platform to access either information or any other thing related to agriculture. So, and given that in terms of technology, China is well advanced in this area. And given that most African countries or startup companies are also trying to support farmers, I can give example. For example, there's this app we call Hello Tractor, and it connects tractor owners with farmers. And still, most of these farmers, some of them don't even have phones, for example. So if some of these farmers can access, affordable, cheap mobile phone, this one can be a good way of them accessing this information. So digitalization, again, given the challenges, through just an handset, a lot of farmers can get a lot of information. And this has been proven to be working in most countries, yes.
The article is Rethinking China's Participation in African Agricultural Development in the Post-COVID-19 Era. As you can see, it sparked a lot of conversation. I love the fact that we're putting these new ideas onto the table to rip apart, to bounce around, to hash out. And this is exactly what we need to do right now. It was written by Duncan Chando, who's a Nairobi-based international development consultant, and also Cathy Cao, a policy and partnerships analyst at the International Fund for Agricultural Development in Beijing. Duncan, Cathy, thank you so much for taking the time to join us. Also, thank you for sharing your wonderful essay with us on the China-Africa Project website. If you want to read this, I will put a link in the show notes, and it's also on our website at chinaafricaproject.com. Duncan, Cathy, thank you so much.
Thank you, Eric.
Thank you so much for having us.
Cobus, I am so excited that the China-Africa Project is becoming a forum for where we can kind of put some of these ideas out there. This is neat, again, as I've mentioned, that we're starting to look beyond the COVID-19 era a little bit as to what can be done. I think each of the 5 points that they raised are very, very interesting. I just disagree with them, respectfully, that it's going to be done by the private sector. I just don't think that the private sector is motivated, is aligned with those objectives. And at this point, even the private sector is under enormous financial strain. So I don't think they're actually capable of doing this. Ultimately, at the end of the day, providing food security is a public responsibility. This is a government responsibility on a mass scale. And this is, again, what I think Cathy brought up the point, which was very interesting, is that harmonization among countries is also a key issue here, because people don't necessarily stay in one place. So when we saw famine and hunger, they start walking and crossing borders. So this is another important thing, to be able to start to harmonize some of the different initiatives in Africa, because climate change, COVID-19, all of these are now regional, if not continental issues that need to be dealt with beyond the national level at some level. And that's a government responsibility, in my view.
Government responsibility, and then a supra-government responsibility, on the lines of the regional economic communities or the African Union. I don't think I would kind of count out the private sector. I just don't think they're going to lead the initiative. I think they're definitely like massive stakeholders, and they bring very kind of like major strengths to the table. And I think one should definitely kind of like widen the net to pull in many Western kind of private sector actors too. The UN, the African Union, like the regional economic blocs, those are probably the bodies that will have to lead this, and national governments.
But they're absolutely right to talk about rethinking how aid and grants are given, in enhancing productivity. This is a discussion that we don't have enough in the context of agriculture. Now, when we talk about productivity, I think people in the US and Europe may have a different view, and you've talked about this a lot, Cobus, as well, that productivity in our mind is automating and industrializing the agricultural process as much as possible so that we get giant super farms. Now, on a productivity level, those are incredibly efficient because basically it's very few people generating an enormous amount of output. But you've said time and again that is not a good fit necessarily for Africa's smallholder farm system. That really wouldn't necessarily deal well with mass industrialization of agriculture.
Yeah, we should also keep in mind that, that it's incredibly productive in the global north at the moment. But what we're seeing is that crop yields have been plateauing for a long time, and in response, they're just adding more and more fertilizer. Like I saw a number recently that there's something like fertilizer levels in some crops have increased by like 700 times. So, I'm not an agriculture expert, but the kind of environmental impact of that kind of production, I think, is now clear. I think it's not only that it's environmentally bad, which it is, but it's just not going to deliver the amount of food that we need for the next, kind of long term. It will only do it for the next 10, 15 years, and then it will definitely start declining. So I think, like what we need is obviously technological innovation, but I think, what's also really important is to look at what the kind of assets are that places like Africa already have, and then build from there. There's lots of knowledge among rural farmers in Africa. There's lots of knowledge on how to work their particular kind of microbiome to get better yields. Those kind of knowledges need to be respected and kind of taken into account, I think, because the only way that you're going to be building a more kind of robust agricultural system is on the back of these people's knowledge. Simply importing knowledge from elsewhere and, kind of paving the kind of the continent in wheat farms, it's not going to work.
The last thing I wanted to kind of point out was the fact that this essay is really important to me because these are two young professionals from Kenya and from China. And it's starting to kind of shape ideas that are outside of the traditional donor space, which has been controlled up until now by US and Europeans. And I think this is really going to be critical for the next evolution. These new ideas about incorporating technology and bringing over Chinese land management experience, which is, again, very different than what you've just pointed out in terms of how the US and Europe have much larger farms. Most of China is still smallholder farms as well. And there's a lot of lessons. Also, the fact that China is dealing with desertification in a very, very serious way up in Inner Mongolia and whatnot, that is lessons and expertise that they can bring over. And so I think that this conversation that happens among young Chinese and African professionals is absolutely essential to find solutions that actually fit between these two partners. And that's something that I don't think we've heard enough of. And I'm really excited that we had that conversation today.
Yeah, I completely agree. And, I think China is in a particularly kind of fruitful position in this respect, not only because its agricultural systems are relatively compatible with that of Africa, but also because Chinese agricultural experts already have a decades-long presence in Africa. So China has been setting up agricultural demonstration centers, as we mentioned in previous episodes, for a long time. So there's already organic, kind of cooperative relationships between these groups. It's You don't have to start it from scratch. So I think that is very promising. It just needs to be ratcheted up.
But at the end of the day, freeing up this debt, the money from the debt is going to be a critical part of whatever happens. And that is really going to be something that we have to pay attention to. Obviously, that's an issue that we follow very closely. Agriculture, debt, COVID-19, how they all overlap with one another. We write about this every day in our China Africa Daily Brief email newsletter. We send this out, and it's so exciting that we send it out every day to a growing audience of readers around the world. We'd love for you to become part of our community of readers. Just $3 for 3 months gets you started. You'll get it every day. If you don't like it, you can cancel it, but we hope that you would do that. Go to ChinaAfricaProject.com/subscribe and check it out. If you have any questions about the newsletter, the podcast, or anything that we're doing here at the China Africa Project, of course, you can always reach Cobus and I. Very, very easy. Eric at ChinaAfricaProject.com and then Cobus at ChinaAfricaProject.com, COBUS. Very easy for us to reach. Better be prepared. We often give very long, detailed email answers back. We love to have these conversations with our listeners and our readers. So that'll do it for this edition of the China in Africa podcast. For Cobus Van Staden in Johannesburg, I'm Eric Olander. Thank you so much for listening.
The discussion continues online. Head over to facebook.com/China Africa Project to share your thoughts on today's show. The guys are also on Twitter, where you can find Cobus at Stadinsky or Eric at E. Olander. And be sure to sign up for the weekly China in Africa email newsletter by going to www.ChinaAfricaProject.com.